Will you join me in the responsive reading printed in your bulletin this morning? The bell is full of wind, though it does not ring. The bird is full of light, though it is still. The sky is full of clouds, though it is alone. The gift is full of story, though the story is yet untold. Open us, deeper story, relationship, heights. I welcome you this morning to Fountain Street Church. I want to say thank you to Dave Hay for being with us. The story that you don't know is that our beloved Marilyn Osenchuk, like many of our family members, is homesick today. So at the very last minute, Dave was willing to step in. We thank you for doing that and wishing Marilyn a speedy recovery. I know that almost every family I know has someone who has come down with an affliction of one kind or another. Let us hold them all in our hearts this day, that they might feel a more spirit of a new year in the days to come.
Good morning, everybody. And I have a story for you, and it's a story that you can think about in terms of blessing, and in terms of innocence, and in terms of gift, and the possibilities of gifts. This is the story of a single grain of rice. There once was a king who had a long and fruitful rule, and he started to wonder about the lessons of life, and he thought he needed to go on a journey to think about and contemplate his life and all of the things that have been in it. He called his daughters. He was blessed with 3 daughters. He called them into this great hall, much like this, and they sat down before him. And he said to his daughters, "I need to go on a journey. I may be gone for a long time." And the daughters said, "Well, how can you go? You can't go. Somebody needs to lead. Somebody needs to guide us and lead us in our kingdom." And the father said, "You shall do this. You will lead while I'm away." And they were all afraid of that possibility. But the father said, "I also have a gift for you. I'm going to give you each a single grain of rice. And you decide what you will do with it. But when I return, and it may be many years, I would like that rice back." And so he gave them each a single grain of rice, and then he went on his journey. And indeed, he was gone for a long time. Now, the eldest daughter, she thought right away and took her rice and wrapped it up in golden thread, and she placed it in a crystal box, and it was beautiful. And she put it up on a shelf, and there it could be waiting in honor for the return of her father, and it would be safe. And the middle daughter, she thought, "What kind of gift is this?" And she threw the rice away and said, I'll get one out of the kitchen when I come back, or when he comes back, and it'll be fine. And the youngest daughter, she took her grain of rice and she thought about it for a whole year, and then decided what she would do. Now, the father, as I had mentioned, the king, was gone for many years. But he did return, and when he returned, it was joyous. His hair was white, and his beard was white, and he had thought about life long and hard, and had managed to, excuse me, I have a cold today, had managed to benefit from that journey. But he was excited to see his daughters again and to receive the rice. And so he called them into the great hall again, and they sat down before him. And the eldest went first, and she said, "Here, Father, here is your rice." And she held up the crystal glass box, and there was the gold thread-wrapped rice kernel in it. And the father took that, the king, and he thought, "Oh, this is nice. What an honor. What an honor. Yes, you've done very well, daughter." And then he turned to the middle daughter, and she had run down to the kitchen and gotten, a rice, found some rice down there, and she stuck it in a little plastic or a little felt bag, but she had dropped it and accidentally stepped on it, and it broke in the bag. But anyway, she handed father the bag, and the king opened the bag and looked and saw the broken rice inside, and closed the bag and said, thank you for returning my rice." And then he looked at his youngest daughter, and his youngest daughter said, "I don't have your rice, Father." And he thought, "What?" He said, "I charged you with returning that rice to me when I came back. Not a difficult thing to do." And he was beginning to get a little upset that she had not honored his wish. And she said, "Father, I don't have your rice here with me, but please, come." And she took him by the elbow and led him to the window. And looking out the window, they saw a vast rice field. And she said, "Father, rice is a seed. I realized, and I planted it. And then more rice yielded more rice, seed. And I planted that, and now we have this." And the king turned to his youngest daughter and said, "You will lead the kingdom." And that's the story of a single grain of rice.
not to take away from Jason's eloquence at all, but the words he began with were those of Emma Goldman, who was perhaps one of the least conspicuously religious people in history, but was among the most spiritually devoted. You should look her up. I also have words from Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote in defense of the rights of women in the 18th century. She then married Percy Bysshe Shelley, and on a cold and gloomy night, she and her husband and others gave each other the challenge of writing a ghost story. Only one of those merits being read today, and that was hers, which was not a ghost story. It was called Frankenstein or the New Prometheus. In that long story, worthy of being read, because it is a parable, she writes through the voice of Victor Frankenstein, "How dangerous is the acquirement of knowledge, and how much happier that man is who believes his native town to be the world than he who aspires to be greater than his nature will allow." After all the lovely cultivation of sentiments around gifts and gift giving, I'm now going to introduce a note of gloom and dismay. I just want you to know that's coming. Jason will give it back to you later. But the story today, called for in the lectionary for Epiphany, does not admit of being cheerful. In the gospel attributed to Matthew, the rest of the nativity story unfolds. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Now, after they had left, an angel of God appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, "Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you. For Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him." When Herod saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he was infuriated, and he sent and killed all the children in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had learned from the wise men. Yes, this too is part of the nativity story. It is tempting, I think, to condemn our age as the worst in human history. After all, we are eyewitnesses to so much, and the sheer mass of misery may well be the most immense because our technology is wonderful and we have so many people to abuse. But believe me, evil has been around since the first days. And as you can tell, it's even in this sweetest of stories, the Nativity. And here's the part that's really problematic. Herod is the only true part of the whole story. All the angels and virgins, Joseph, shepherds, magi, the census, the inn, all of that is almost beyond doubt fiction. But Herod was real. And he was really as bad as he's made out to be. He came to power by intrigue and lived, therefore, in constant fear of intrigue against him. He spent much of his time dispatching suspected plotters, which included a wife and 2 sons. The Christmas story says that all Jerusalem was troubled with him because Herod was afraid, and when he was afraid, everyone looked over his or her shoulder. If there is a symbol of evil in the gospel, of real human evil, Herod is it. Even Judas felt remorse later. Herod never did. Herod is almost inhumanly bad. In the poem For the Time Being by Winston Hugh Auden, from which I quoted last week, a very long poem about the Nativity, Auden gives Herod actually the longest sustained utterance in the whole poem. In fact, it's not a poem, it's a soliloquy, it's a long passage, several pages long. I wish I could read all of it, but I'm going to give you a substantial portion so you can see what Herod looks like, perhaps through a different set of eyes. Herod is speaking now in the voice of Auden. There is no visible disorder, no crime. What could be more innocent than the birth of an artisan's child? There is nothing in the whole magnificent panorama of plain and mountains to indicate that the empire is threatened by a danger more dreadful than any invasion of Tartars on racing camels or any conspiracy by the Praetorian Guard. Today, apparently, judging by the trio who came to see me this morning with an ecstatic grin on their scholarly faces, the job has been done. God has been born, they cried. We've seen him ourselves. The world is saved. Nothing else matters. Well, one needn't be much of a psychologist to realize that if this rumor is not stamped out now, in a few years it is capable of diseasing the whole empire. And one doesn't have to be a prophet to predict the consequences if it did. Reason will be replaced by revelation. Instead of rational law, objective truths perceptible to any and the same for all, knowledge will degenerate into a riot of subjective visions. Idealism will be replaced by materialism. Life after death will be an eternal dinner party where all the guests are 20 years old. The needs of the materialistic masses for some visible idol to worship will be driven into totally unsocial channels where no education can reach it. Justice will be replaced by pity as the cardinal human virtue, and all fear of retribution will vanish. Every corner boy will congratulate himself. I'm such a sinner that God had to come down in person to save me. I must be the devil of a fellow. Every crook will argue, I like committing crimes, God likes forgiving them, really the world is admirably arranged. Naturally, this cannot be allowed to happen. Civilization must be saved, even if this means sending for the military, as I suppose it does. How dreary. How dear. Why couldn't this wretched infant be born somewhere else? Why can't people be sensible? I don't want to be horrid. I've worked like a slave. Ask anyone you like. I've read all official dispatches without skipping. I've taken elocution lessons. I've hardly ever taken bribes. I've tried to be good. I brush my teeth every night. I object. I'm a liberal. You can see that Auden is giving us the picture of a modern political leader faced with a terrible dilemma. So, shall he commit a small atrocity to prevent the greater catastrophe? Yes, something ugly and unpleasant, but sometimes leaders have to do these things, don't they? It makes a kind of sense, like torture to prevent terrorism. Who could object to that? This Herod is very much like us. He's not a Hitler or a Stalin, but a Robert McNamara, a Donald Rumsfeld, those who calculate the costs and benefits, the risks and the outcomes, as any of us would do. My point is that we humans are fallible creatures, every one, including people like us, well-minded, bleeding-heart liberals who never do anything wrong, forgetting that this is the original and actual slippery slope, because the real source of evil on a day-to-day basis is not malevolence with a mustache being twirled, but the innocence of good intentions. You heard me right. Innocence is the source of evil. The vast amount of evil gets done by innocent people, those who don't see themselves as evil and who aren't in any classic sense of the word. Yes, there are monsters out there, but most monstrosities are wrought by ordinary people with noble ideas, assuming that their actions will be noble as a result. Mary Shelley reminded us of the irony here in her retelling of the Prometheus legend, Frankenstein. We do well to remember that Frankenstein is not the name of the creature, but of the scientist whose aspirations to create life were so noble, so heartfelt, so true, so decent, so objective and scientific. What could go wrong? Herod was saving the country from turmoil. Nixon was only playing politics. The previous administration was only protecting us from terrorists. They and all the other managers of power forget that innocent intention. Noble intention does not guarantee an innocent or a good outcome. If there is a primal basis for conservatism, this is it. The road to hell, at least on earth, is truly paved with good intentions. We revere innocence in our culture, though. We truly revere it. It's charming, the smooth-cheeked faces of children who are innocent, of course. And of course, whenever there's a terrible tragedy and people perish, we refer to them as innocent victims, as though something like a guilty victim could exist. Can we even say the word victim without adding the word innocent? That's the very definition of a victim, isn't it? Someone who is innocent of the harm they receive. But there is a troubling aspect of this phrase, innocent victim, that I need to unravel for you. Of course, victims are innocent of blame for what hurt them, but I think sometimes our culture infers that being a victim imparts a sort of moral baptism to the victim. Their undeserved suffering somehow cleanses them, purifies them, and makes them more innocent than everyone else. Victims become noble, sinless, as baptism makes one sinless. Just as baptism supposedly means one is reborn, so suffering as a victim makes you an infant again, innocent and pure. A full exploration of the whole notion of innocence would take us back to when innocence meant purity without blemish, to a time when ancient religions sacrificed animals to expiate sins, and all the animals had to be pure and without blemish. This is the notion behind the sinless Christ, who had to be pure in order for his sacrifice to be effective. It would also entail the idea of purity as attached to virginity, and lost innocence is a phrase meaning a woman who was no longer a virgin. It would also remind us that Mary's virginity in the story is important because it means this is why we know Jesus was born innocent, pure, and very suitable, therefore, for sacrifice. All this and more are bound up in the concept of innocence, making it an idea that is ironically far from innocent. The story in Matthew is called the Massacre of the Holy Innocents. That's wrong. There are no holy innocents in this world because there are no innocents at all. Yes, babes in arms are as complicit in the world as we are. They may not be guilty of crimes, but they are not innocent bystanders either. And anyone who's ever watched a playground knows that children can be just as cruel and mean as any grown-up. They're just not very good at it yet. But far more sin, as I said earlier, far more harm is done from we adults who think ourselves innocent and therefore blind ourselves to the consequences of our best but ever imperfect and infallible intentions. One of my favorite songs in the world is from the theater. It's from Meredith Willson's play, The Music Man, in which Harold Hill tells his friend Marcellus Washburn that he prefers the sadder but wiser girl. Do look it up. Because it talks about how the innocent girl unwittingly does more harm than the one who has been around the block, shall we say. I would prefer we lived in a sadder but wiser world. Perhaps less cheerful, but a little bit more aware of what the world is about. A world where we know that the righteous rage over abortion is also about the persistence of sexism and gender injustice. A world where we realize that our healthcare system is not driven by health but by money. and where our education and criminal justice systems are as much defined by race and class as they are by justice and law. I wish that we could admit, sadly but wisely, that we rationalize our fear of immigrants so we think that we're not really afraid of them, but that somehow they're bad. Or that we rationalize our contempt for the poor as lazy and drug-addled when in fact they're simply poor. And we excuse our exploitation of the earth as impractical to deal with. We all know why evil happens. We make excuses for it every day. The world is imperfect. I'm imperfect. Why should I try to be different? You might as well swim upstream. Because we also know that we could all do a little more to make a more perfect world. And we choose not to. Even if we don't believe in a God or the Bible, we all know we are sinners. As I said, you deserve a hopeful word. It's a new year. You want to start fresh. You want to feel good. And I'm being a real downer, aren't I? You want something to sustain you in the coming weeks of the cold and the dark. But I'm here to tell you that the via negativa, the passage through the dark, is also the passage to truth as well. I'm here to tell you there are no innocent victims on the planet. There are only guilty perpetrators of hideous crimes and no just suffering at all. Suffering of all kinds is evil no matter who suffers. Having spoken of faith and hope and love and joy all during Advent, I'm here to cast a pall over them all and say, forget it. It's all wrong. But I'm not saying that. If one reads the Nativity story honestly, this truth, dreadful and undeniable, that even the best of hopes, the kindest of children, the most loving of angels, the most beneficent of shepherds and wise men cannot stop Herod's armies from slaughtering again. Joseph had to flee. The wise men escaped. The star went out. And the soldiers came, and there was weeping in Ramah. And here, believe it or not, is where the gift begins. Because it is here that the story that ends at Easter really begins. It is not in the charm of the birth, but in the flight into Egypt. It is not in the angels, but in the presence of Herod. It is here where entrenched evil, masquerading as innocence, beguiling us with the promise that none of us can do any wrong because we're so nice. This is what Jesus came to tell us we had to get over. That all of our hands are dirty. But then again, all work makes one a little dirty, doesn't it? Genuine faith and honest hope start here at the end of the story. No matter how hard it is, the star went out. The work begins. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be found true in thy sight, thou who art my rock and my redeemer. Amen and amen. And by the way, have a happy new year.